Imagine watching your entire world burn to ashes, your home destroyed, your father murdered before your eyes, only to be dragged before the very king responsible for it all. But instead of execution, he points to you and declares, "She will be my queen." The royal court despises you. Conspirators seek to use you as a weapon. And every night you lie awake planning your revenge against the man who made you his unwilling bride. Yet in the shadows of the castle, you witness something impossible. The king, your enemy, weeping alone, tormented by secrets darker than you could have imagined. What truth lies buried beneath the ruins of your village? Why would a ruthless king choose a peasant as his queen? And when he finally enters your chambers and discovers the dagger in your trembling hand, why does he offer his unprotected heart instead of punishment? As chinzas do in Ichiu. The smell of ash hung in the air like a shroud, mingling with the desperate sobs of children that echoed through what remained of Iloan's village. Just hours ago, these had been homes, humble cottages where families had laughed, argued, and loved. Now they were nothing but smoldering ruins, monuments to a king's cruel whim. Iloan felt the rough hands of soldiers dig into her arms as they dragged her across the village square. Her bare feet scraped against the stone, catching on shards of broken pottery and splintered wood, blood mixed with soot between her toes. But this pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache in her chest. Through tear-blurred eyes, she caught glimpses of familiar faces, neighbors now on their knees, heads bowed in defeat. And then she saw him. King Aldrich sat atop his midnight stallion, his posture straight and unforgiving as iron. The royal crown gleamed mockingly in the afternoon sun, each jewel catching the light as if celebrating the devastation below. His eyes, cold and gray as winter, swept over the village without emotion until they settled upon her. Something shifted in his gaze then, a flicker of, what? Not remorse, surely. Men like him knew nothing of such feelings. "Stand her before me," he commanded, his voice carrying across the unnatural silence that had fallen. The soldiers obeyed, forcing Iloan to her feet. Her dress, once the color of spring wheat, was now torn and blackened with ash. Her long auburn hair hung in tangled knots around her face, and she could taste blood where she had bitten her lip to keep from screaming. She refused to lower her eyes. Let him see her hatred. The king studied her for an uncomfortably long moment before raising his gloved hand. With that simple gesture, the remaining villagers held their collective breath. "This woman," he declared, voice cutting through the air like a blade, "shall be my wife." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Iloan felt her knees threaten to buckle beneath her. The words struck her like a physical blow, more devastating than any sword could be. "Your Majesty," one of the braver soldiers ventured, "she's but a peasant girl." Silence. A single word spoken softly, yet carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I have decided." In that moment, Iloan knew her life had ended. Not in death, that would have been a mercy, but in something far worse. She would live as a trophy, a reminder to all of the king's absolute power, to take not just homes and lives, but to claim even a woman's future as his property. Her mind flashed to her father. Just hours ago, she had watched him die, his body pierced by arrows as he had tried to shield her from the soldiers. The memory of his final breath tore through her, and she began to tremble, not from fear, but from a rage so profound it threatened to consume her entirely. Around her, the surviving villagers exchanged glances of horror and pity. Women whispered hurried prayers, their fingers tracing sacred symbols in the air. Men who had known her since childhood now averted their gaze, shame evident in their slumped shoulders. Even the wind seemed to carry the weight of her humiliation, rustling through the charred remains of what had once been home. The heavy chains that had bound her wrists were unlocked with a harsh metallic click. The sudden absence of their weight felt strange, almost disorienting. Freedom, but for what purpose? To walk willingly into another form of imprisonment. Two soldiers hauled her forward until she stood directly beneath the king's mount. Up close, she could smell the leather of his saddle, the metallic scent of the armor beneath his royal cloak. His face was younger than she had imagined, perhaps only 30 winters. with a scar running along his jawline that disappeared into his neatly trimmed beard. The king leaned down from his saddle, close enough that only she could hear his words. His breath was warm against her ear, a jarring contrast to the ice in his voice. "From this day forward, you are my queen, whether you will it or not." The shock of his declaration coursed through Eowyn's body like a blade of ice. She had expected to be taken as a servant, perhaps even a concubine, but queen? What cruel game was this? Before she could respond, strong hands lifted her onto the saddle in front of the king. The horse shifted beneath the additional weight, and she felt the king's arms snake around her waist, holding her firmly against him, a gesture that might have appeared protective to onlookers, but felt like the grip of a jailer. As the royal party prepared to depart, a heart-wrenching cry cut through the eerie silence. Eowyn turned to see her mother, face streaked with tears and ash, pushing past the guards. "Eowyn!" her mother screamed, desperation making her voice crack. "Never forgive him! Never!" The soldiers moved to strike the woman down, but the king raised his hand, stopping them with a gesture. His expression remained unreadable as he watched the grief-stricken mother fall to her knees in the dirt. As they rode away from the ruins, whispers followed them like shadows. How could a prisoner become a queen? What twisted purpose did the king harbor? What fate awaited this daughter of a destroyed village within the cold stone walls of the royal castle? Eowyn felt numb as the village, her entire world until now, grew smaller behind them. The procession of soldiers and horses moved in grim silence along the forest road. No one dared speak to her, though she caught curious glances from the king's men. Hours passed like this, until the trees thinned, and the landscape opened to reveal rolling hills crowned by a massive stone fortress. Banners bearing the king's crest, a black wolf on crimson, fluttered from its towers. The castle stood as a monument to power and domination, its walls seeming to touch the very clouds. As they approached the great iron gates, Eowyn's heart hammered against her ribs. This would be her prison, her tomb. The woman she had been, the daughter of a miller, a girl who had dreamed of marrying the blacksmith's son, would die here, replaced by whatever the king wished her to become. The gates opened with a thunderous groan, revealing a courtyard filled with servants and nobles who had gathered to witness the king's return. Their curious eyes fell upon her, this strange ash-covered woman seated before their monarch, and new whispers erupted like wildfire. When the king dismounted and reached up to help her down, Eowyn stared directly into his eyes and made a silent vow. She would never bow, never break. Whatever game he played, whatever cruelty he had planned, she would endure. And one day, somehow, she would make him pay for everything he had taken from her. As she took her first steps into the castle, Eowyn didn't notice the figure watching from a shadowed doorway. A presence that would soon change everything she thought she knew about her captor and the mysterious circumstances that had brought her here. O Trono das Correntes. The great hall of Aldrich's castle struck Eowyn like a physical blow. Vast and imposing, it seemed designed to make ordinary souls feel insignificant. Crimson tapestries depicting brutal battle scenes hung from stone walls that stretched upward to a vaulted ceiling where iron chandeliers cast flickering shadows. Golden goblets caught the light from hundreds of beeswax candles, their flames dancing as if celebrating her humiliation. Eowyn stood frozen at the entrance, still wearing her tattered dress, covered in the ashes of her former life. The contrast between her appearance and the opulence surrounding her could not have been more stark or more deliberate. She realized with sickening clarity that this was another form of subjugation, perhaps crueler than chains. "Come," the king commanded, not bothering to look back as he strode forward. The assembled nobles parted before him like water, bowing deeply as he passed. When their eyes fell upon Eowyn, following uncertainly in his wake, their expressions transformed into masks of disbelief and thinly veiled contempt. She heard their whispers, sharp as daggers despite their hushed tones. "A peasant? Here? Look at her filthy state. Is she a prisoner? Surely His Majesty cannot mean to keep her in the castle." A woman in an elaborate emerald gown leaned toward her companion, making no effort to lower her voice. Perhaps she amused him on his campaign. Men do develop strange appetites during war. Laughter rippled through the hall, and Elowen felt heat rising to her cheeks. She had never known humiliation could be a physical pain, burning through her veins and settling like a stone in her stomach. Yet she forced her chin up, refusing to provide these pampered vultures the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. The king reached his throne, an imposing seat of dark wood and iron, cushioned with red velvet, and turned to face the assembly. For a moment, his eyes met Elowen's across the expanse of polished stone floor. Something unreadable flickered in his expression before he addressed the court. "My lords and ladies," he began, his voice echoing throughout the hall, "I have returned victorious from the eastern borders. The rebels have been dealt with. Their villages—" Here he paused, the slightest hesitation that only Elowen seemed to notice. "Their villages now understand the cost of defiance." Murmurs of approval spread through the gathering. Elowen felt her frail shoulders droop under the weight of invisible chains. These people were celebrating the destruction of her home, the deaths of her neighbors, her father. "I have also returned with news that will shape the future of our kingdom," the king continued. His gaze swept across the assembled nobility before settling back on Elowen. "I have chosen a queen." The silence that followed was absolute, as if every person in the hall had forgotten how to breathe. Then, like a dam breaking, voices erupted in confusion and disbelief. "A queen? But your majesty has refused every noble daughter for years. Surely he doesn't mean—" King Aldrich raised his hand, and silence fell once more. "This woman," he said, gesturing toward Elowen, "will be my wife. The wedding will take place tonight." Tonight. The word hit Elowen like a blow to her chest. Not in weeks or days, but hours. No time to plan, to think, to find a way out of this nightmare. The court exploded in barely contained outrage. A gray-haired man stepped forward, his rich blue robes marking him as a person of significant rank. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice strained with forced civility, "might I suggest a period of preparation? The lady appears to need time to be properly instructed in court etiquette. Perhaps several months of training before such a momentous—" "The wedding," the king repeated, cutting through the advisor's words with cold precision, "will be tonight. See that she is bathed and properly attired. Lady Marwen will oversee the preparations." A thin woman with sharp features and graying hair stepped forward, her pinched expression making it clear how little she relished this assignment. She curtsied stiffly before approaching Elowen. "Come, girl," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have much to do and little time." What followed was a blur of indignities. Elowen was whisked away to chambers where servants stripped her naked and scrubbed her skin until it was raw. They washed her hair 3 times to remove all traces of ash, tutting disapprovingly at its unruly waves. No one spoke to her directly, discussing her as if she were a troublesome animal being groomed for market. "Such rough hands," one maid murmured to another, "a peasant through and through." "The king must have his reasons," replied her companion, though what they could be. Lady Marwen supervised with cold efficiency, instructing the maids on how to disguise Elowen's common features as best they could. A dress appeared, white silk and silver thread, clearly sewn in haste but still more beautiful than anything Elowen had ever worn. It hung from her thin frame awkwardly, designed for a woman with more curves and less height. "It will have to do," Lady Marwen declared. "There's no time for proper alterations." As the sun began to set, painting the stone walls with orange light, Elowen found herself being led back to the great hall. Now transformed, she appeared outwardly a different woman, clean, perfumed, adorned with borrowed jewels that felt as heavy as shackles around her throat and wrists. Yet inside, she remained the same, a prisoner in finer chains. The ceremony itself was a mockery of everything a wedding should be. No flowers brightened the austere hall. No music softened the harsh atmosphere. The court stood in rigid formation, their faces masks of disapproval. A priest spoke words Elowen barely heard, his eyes never meeting hers, as if she were beneath his notice. When the moment came for the king to kiss his bride, Elowen felt her entire body go rigid. His lips pressed against hers, firm but brief, a seal on a contract rather than an expression of affection. The court watched in stunned silence, witnessing not a union of love but an act of possession. "Long live the Queen," someone finally called, their voice hollow. "Long live the Queen," others echoed, the words falling like stones in the cavernous space. The feast that followed was equally joyless. Elowen sat beside the king, untouching the elaborate dishes placed before her. Her stomach twisted with hunger. She had not eaten since before the attack on her village, but she could not bring herself to swallow a morsel in this place. The king himself spoke little, occasionally leaning toward advisors who approached the high table with matters requiring his attention. Not once did he address her directly. She was a symbol, Elowen realized, though of what, she could not guess. As the night wore on, dread began to build within her. The wedding night. Would this final humiliation be forced upon her as well? The thought made bile rise in her throat. But when the traditional calls for the bedding ceremony began, King Aldrich silenced them with a sharp gesture. "My queen is tired," he announced. "She will retire to her chambers alone tonight." Confused murmurs spread through the hall, but none dared question him openly. A servant girl was summoned to lead Elowen to her new quarters, not the king's chambers, as tradition would dictate, but private rooms in the eastern wing of the castle. The chambers were luxurious by any standard, a massive bed with silk hangings, windows overlooking the moonlit gardens, a fire crackling in a stone hearth, yet they felt as confining as any dungeon. Elowen dismissed the hovering maid with a silent nod and finally found herself alone. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her fingers clutching the fine fabric of her wedding dress. Tears that she had refused to shed all day finally spilled over, tracking silently down her cheeks. She thought of her mother's final cry, "Never forgive him," and felt the weight of that promise settle into her bones. The sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor outside froze her in place. Her heart stuttered in her chest as she stared at the door. Was it him? Had he changed his mind? Or perhaps someone sent to ensure her permanent silence? The latch moved slowly, the well-oiled hinges making barely a sound as the heavy wooden door began to swing inward. Elowen rose to her feet, instinctively backing toward the window as a tall figure appeared in the doorway. The flickering candlelight revealed not the king, but the silhouette of a man she had never seen before. A knight, judging by his bearing, though he wore no armor now. His face remained partially shadowed, but she could see enough to know this was someone with purpose in his unexpected visit. "My queen," he said softly, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk." "A voz do cavallero." The knight moved into the chamber with the fluid grace of a man trained for battle, yet his steps were deliberately quiet, almost furtive. Moonlight streaming through the window caught the outline of his broad shoulders and the glint of a sword hilt at his side. Without the bulk of armor, he appeared leaner than most warriors, but no less dangerous. Elowen pressed her back against the cold stone wall, scanning the room for anything she might use as a weapon. A silver candlestick, perhaps, or the fire poker by the hearth. But before she could move, the knight did something entirely unexpected. He knelt before her. One knee touched the ornate carpet, his head bowed in a gesture of deference that caught Elowen completely off guard. When he raised his face to meet her gaze, she saw features that were handsome but severe, a face accustomed to giving commands rather than taking them. "Forgive the intrusion, my queen," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle despite its depth. There was genuine concern in his eyes, not the cold calculation she had come to expect from everyone in this castle. "I am Sir Tristan, captain of the Eastern Garrison." Elowen remained silent, distrustful. A position so close to the king meant this man had likely participated in the destruction of her village. His respectful tone could easily be another form of manipulation. "I know what you must think of me," he continued, as if reading her thoughts. "But I beg you to listen. You are in far greater danger than you realize." A bitter laugh escaped her lips, the first sound she had made voluntarily since being brought to this place. "Greater danger? I have been torn from my home, watched my father die, been forced to marry the man responsible for it all. What greater danger could possibly threaten me now?" Sir Tristan glanced toward the door, then lowered his voice further. The danger of being a pawn in a game whose rules you do not yet understand. He rose to his feet but kept a respectful distance. This marriage, it is not what it seems. It seems like imprisonment, Elowin replied coldly. It seems like the final humiliation a tyrant could inflict upon someone who has already lost everything. The knight shook his head. If simple humiliation were His Majesty's goal, there are far easier ways to achieve it. No, my lady, there is more at stake than you know. His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Do not trust the king. This marriage places you in a position more perilous than you can imagine. Something in his tone, an urgency, a sincerity, made Elowin hesitate. She took a step forward, studying his face for any sign of deception. Why should I trust you instead? You serve him. I serve the crown, Tristan corrected. Sometimes that means protecting the kingdom from the king himself. The words hung in the air between them, dangerous as drawn blades. Treason, whispered a voice in her mind. This conversation alone could see them both executed. Elowin wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how thin the silk of her wedding dress was against the night's chill, or perhaps it was the night's words that made her shiver. What are you saying? I'm saying that there are secrets buried beneath the foundation of this castle. Secrets that explain why your village was targeted, why you were chosen. Tristan's voice had taken on an edge, like a knife cutting through the darkness. The attack on your home was not random. And your marriage is not merely a cruel whim. Elowin felt her knees weaken. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her mind racing. My village was just a small farming community. We had nothing of value. We posed no threat. That is what makes the king's actions so puzzling to most of the court, Tristan replied. But I have served in his personal guard for 7 years. I've seen the changes in him, heard the fragments of conversations not meant for others. There is something he seeks, something he believes is connected to your people. A cold realization washed over her. You're part of a conspiracy against the king. Tristan neither confirmed nor denied her accusation. Instead, he approached slowly and lowered himself to one knee again, this time directly before her. From this distance, she could see a thin scar running through his left eyebrow and the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. My lady, I am telling you this at great risk to myself, because I believe you deserve to know the truth, and because you may be the only person who can help uncover it. His expression softened with compassion. What happened to your village, to your family, was unforgivable, but rushing blindly into revenge would be fatal. Elowin recoiled slightly. I never mentioned revenge. A sad smile touched the knight's lips. You didn't have to. I would feel the same in your position. He reached out as if to touch her hand, then thought better of it and withdrew. But there are others watching you now. Others who would use your pain for their own purposes. Her mind flashed to the nobles in the great hall, their calculating stares and venomous whispers, to Lady Marwen's cold efficiency, to the servants who avoided meeting her eyes. In this place of stone and shadows, who could she possibly trust? What would you have me do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Watch, listen, learn to navigate this court before choosing your allies. Tristan's gaze was steady, unflinching. The king is not what he appears to be. There are things he does when he believes himself unobserved. Things that might help you understand. Understand what? Why he destroyed your village. Why he chose you as his queen. Tristan leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower. Listen to what he whispers when he thinks he's alone. Only then will you begin to understand who he truly is. Before she could ask more, Tristan's head snapped up, his body tensing like a bowstring. He'd heard something beyond her perception, perhaps the distant tread of guards making their rounds. In one fluid motion, he rose to his feet. I've stayed too long, he murmured. Remember what I said. Trust no one entirely, not even me. Form your own judgments based on what you observe. He moved toward the door with the silent grace of a predator, pausing with his hand on the latch. Tomorrow, the court will watch your every move, waiting for you to falter. Show them nothing of your true thoughts. Wait, Elowen called softly. "How will I find you if I need to speak with you again?" Tristan gave her a measured look. "You won't. I'll find you when it's safe." Then, as an afterthought, "The gardens near the Eastern Tower are rarely visited after midday prayers. If you walk there, you might find answers, or allies." With that cryptic advice, he slipped through the door and was gone, leaving Elowen alone with a head full of questions and a heart torn between doubt and desperate hope. She remained motionless on the edge of the bed, replaying the knight's words in her mind. Was he truly an ally? Or was this another layer of court intrigue? A test, perhaps, to gauge her loyalty to her new husband. The king's enemies might see her as a vulnerable point, a way to strike at the monarch through his unusual choice of bride. Yet something in Tristan's manner had seemed genuine. The concern in his eyes didn't feel manufactured. And if what he said was true, if her village had been destroyed for a specific purpose rather than random cruelty, then everything changed. Revenge was no longer just about justice, but about uncovering truth. Elowen moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit castle grounds below. Somewhere in this maze of stone and secrets lay answers, and somewhere, perhaps, lay a path to freedom, or at least to understanding. Her new life as a queen, unwanted, unexpected, undeserved, had just become infinitely more complex. No longer was she merely a victim seeking vengeance. Now she was a player in a game whose board she couldn't yet see, whose pieces she couldn't identify. "Listen to what he whispers when he thinks he's alone," Tristan had said. The advice echoed in her mind as she stared at the distant tower where the king's private chambers were located. What secrets did he harbor in the darkness? What whispers would reveal the man behind the crown? The suffocating silence of her room pressed around her, broken only by the occasional crack from the dying fire. In this strange new world of intrigue and danger, Elowen realized that her nightmare had gained a new dimension, one where even her hatred for the king was no longer simple and pure, but complicated by questions she had never thought to ask. That night, she did not sleep. Instead, she sat by the window, watching as the moon traced its path across the sky, counting the hours until dawn would bring her first full day as queen of a kingdom that despised her. A queen with no power, no allies she could trust, and a husband whose very nature remained a mystery. But when the first pale light of morning began to color the eastern sky, Elowen heard something unexpected, a sound so faint she thought at first she had imagined it. Rising from her vigil by the window, she pressed her ear against the cold stone wall. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of weeping, muffled by distance but clear in the pre-dawn silence. Following the sound, she moved silently across her chamber and opened the door to the corridor beyond. Empty. The guards who had been stationed there earlier were gone, perhaps changing shifts or summoned elsewhere. It was the opportunity she needed. Barefoot, still wearing her wedding gown, Elowen slipped into the corridor and followed the sound that grew clearer with each step. It led her toward the great hall, the heart of the castle, where just hours ago she had been forced to wed her enemy. As she approached the massive doors, the weeping resolved itself into something even more shocking. It was the voice of a man, broken by grief, echoing in the emptiness of the hall beyond. The king's voice. "O rey de ferro e lágrimas." Elowen hesitated at the threshold of the great hall, her heart hammering against her ribs. The massive oak doors stood slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of dim light to escape into the corridor. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall, suddenly aware of the madness of her actions. If caught spying on the king, what punishment might await her? Yet the sound of his grief, so raw, so unexpected, drew her forward like an invisible thread. Holding her breath, she edged closer to the narrow opening between the doors. The hem of her wedding gown whispered against the flagstones, and she gathered the silk in her hands to silence it. Through the gap, she could see a portion of the vast hall, now transformed by shadows and moonlight. The tables had been cleared away after the wedding feast, leaving the space cavernous and empty. A few dying torches cast pools of flickering amber light against the gloom, and there, seated not upon his throne but on the stone steps leading up to it, was King Aldric. Illawen had expected to find a tyrant reveling in his power, a monster gloating over his conquests. Instead, the sight before her seemed to belong to another world entirely. The king's crown lay discarded on the floor beside him, his dark hair falling forward to hide his face. His shoulders, so straight and proud during the day's ceremonies, now curved inward like a man carrying an unbearable weight. One hand pressed against his eyes, the other gripped his knee with such force that his knuckles gleamed white in the torchlight. The sound that escaped him was not the dignified grief of a monarch, but the broken sobs of a man utterly alone. Each ragged breath echoed against the stone walls, returning to him like ghostly companions to his misery. Illawen remained frozen, unable to reconcile this image with the man who had ordered her village burned. This vulnerability seemed impossible. A trick of the light, perhaps, or a calculated performance for unseen witnesses. Yet who would the king perform for in the empty hours before dawn, when he believed himself entirely alone? As if answering her unspoken question, Aldrich's voice suddenly filled the hall, hoarse with emotion. "How many more?" he whispered to the shadows. "How many more will suffer for my weakness?" He raised his face, and Illawen caught her first clear glimpse of the king without his mask of authority. Tears had carved shining paths down his cheeks. His eyes, red-rimmed and haunted, stared unseeing at some middle distance, as if confronting visions only he could perceive. "I had no choice," he continued, seemingly addressing the empty air. "You know I had no choice." A chill crept along Illawen's spine. Was the king mad, speaking to ghosts or figments of his imagination? She leaned forward slightly, straining to hear his next words. "The eastern villages were the key," he murmured. "The scrolls confirmed it. If I didn't act first, they would have." He broke off, pressing the heels of his palms against his eyes. "God forgive me. They were innocent. They didn't know what lay beneath their feet." Confusion swirled in Illawen's mind. Scrolls? What could possibly lie beneath a simple farming village that would warrant its destruction? Sir Tristan's warning echoed in her thoughts. "This marriage places you in a position more perilous than you can imagine." The king rose suddenly, moving with restless energy to pace before the throne. In the guttering torchlight, his shadow stretched and distorted across the floor like some great winged creature. He seemed younger somehow, stripped of the formal regalia and cold demeanor he presented to the court. "And now I've brought her here," he said, his voice barely audible across the distance. "Another innocent, another life to destroy." A bitter laugh escaped him. "A queen from the ashes. Perhaps it's fitting, the only atonement I can offer." Illawen felt her breath catch. Was he speaking of her? Atonement suggested regret, perhaps even remorse. Yet how could a man truly regret his actions while continuing to benefit from them? To destroy a village, murder its people, then claim the survivor as his queen. What kind of atonement was that? She must have made some small sound, for the king's head snapped up, his gaze suddenly alert. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice instantly transforming back into the commanding tone she recognized. The vulnerability vanished as completely as if it had never existed, replaced by the cold authority of a monarch. "Show yourself!" Illawen shrank back into the shadows of the corridor, her heart pounding so loudly she feared he might hear it. She pressed a hand over her mouth, willing herself to become as insubstantial as the darkness around her. For several agonizing heartbeats, she remained perfectly still, anticipating the sound of approaching footsteps, the firm grip of the king's hand on her arm. Instead, she heard a heavy sigh, followed by the soft metallic sound of the crown being retrieved from the floor. When she dared peek through the gap again, she saw Aldrich standing before his throne, crown restored to his head, composure firmly in place. Only the redness around his eyes hinted at the broken man he had been moments before. As silently as she could, Illawen backed away from the door and hurried down the corridor, her bare feet making no sound on the cold stone. Her mind raced with what she had witnessed. The King of Iron had a heart after all, or at least the capacity for tears. But did that make him more human, or merely more dangerous? When she reached her chambers, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to illuminate the eastern windows. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her with trembling hands. For the first time since her capture, Elowen felt something beyond the burning certainty of hatred and fear, the unsettling flicker of doubt. She crossed to the window, gazing out at the castle grounds as they emerged from darkness. The morning mist clung to the gardens and walls like a gauzy veil, softening the harsh lines of stone and metal. Just as the mist blurred the clear boundaries of the physical world, her glimpse of the king's private grief had blurred the sharp edges of her understanding. If Aldrich truly regretted the destruction of her village, why had he ordered it? What threat could a community of farmers and craftspeople possibly pose to a king? What secrets could lie buried beneath their modest homes that would justify such brutality? More importantly, what did it mean for her? She had been prepared to face a monster, a tyrant whose heart was as cold and hard as the iron of his soldiers' weapons. She knew how to hate such a creature. But this man, this contradiction of cruelty and remorse, of power and vulnerability, how was she to understand him? Elowen sank onto the edge of her bed, suddenly exhausted. The wedding dress she still wore felt heavy and constraining, a physical manifestation of her new reality. She was queen now, however unwilling, however unprepared. Perhaps that position could offer her something beyond mere survival. Perhaps it could give her the means to discover the truth. Sir Tristan had warned her to watch, to listen, to learn before choosing her allies. Tonight she had done exactly that, and what she had discovered had shaken the foundations of her understanding. The king was not merely the sword that had destroyed her home. He was also the hand that trembled while wielding it. That knowledge did not diminish her pain or erase her desire for justice. Her father was still dead. Her village still lay in ruins. Her freedom had still been taken. But now, alongside the burning flame of her anger, burned the smaller, steadier light of curiosity. Who was this man who could order a massacre and then weep over it in solitude? What forces drove him to such contradictions? As the sun rose fully over the castle walls, Elowen finally allowed herself to lie down. Her mind continued to race with questions, but her body demanded rest. The last image before sleep claimed her was the king kneeling on the stone floor of the great hall, his crown discarded beside him, his shoulders shaking with the force of his hidden grief. "How many more will suffer for my weakness?" he had asked the empty air. In her dreams, Elowen found herself standing before him, offering an answer. No more. No one else need suffer if you choose a different path. But when she woke hours later to the sound of a servant entering with a tray of food, the clarity of her dreams had faded. In its place was the cold reality of her situation. She was still a prisoner in a gilded cage, married to the man responsible for destroying everything she had ever loved. And today, she would have to face him again. Not as the broken figure she had glimpsed in the pre-dawn shadows, but as the king, her husband, her captor. As Elowen allowed the servants to dress her in the finery befitting her new station, she schooled her features into a mask of calm indifference. Whatever the king's private torments might be, they changed nothing about her position. She would continue to watch, to listen, to learn. And when the time was right, she would understand the truth that lay at the heart of this mystery, even if that truth proved more complex and painful than the simple hatred that had sustained her until now. Au Banquet de Vergogne. The summons arrived shortly after midday, delivered by a stone-faced servant who refused to meet Elowen's eyes. A formal banquet would be held that evening, her first public appearance as queen. The thought made her stomach clench with dread. One day, as a reluctant bride, had been torment enough. Now she would be paraded before the entire court like some exotic curiosity. Lady Marwyn arrived soon after with an entourage of maids and seamstresses, their arms laden with fabrics and jewels. Unlike the hasty preparations for the wedding, this transformation would be deliberate and thorough, a calculated display of royal power. "You must understand, girl," Lady Marwyn said as she circled Elowen with critical eyes, "that tonight is not about you. It is about what you represent. The king's choice must appear inspired, not impulsive." The hours that followed were an exercise in humiliation disguised as elevation. Elowen was bathed in milk and rose water, her skin rubbed with oils until it gleamed. Her hair, which had always hung in simple waves down her back, was twisted and pinned into an elaborate style that made her scalp ache. Cosmetics were applied to her face, powders to lighten her sun-kissed complexion, rouge to color her cheeks, kohl to darken her eyes. "Too peasant-like," Lady Marwen muttered, examining Elowen's hands. "Nothing to be done about the calluses now. We'll cover them with rings." And cover them they did. Heavy gold rings set with rubies and emeralds were forced onto her fingers, so many that she could barely bend her knuckles. A necklace of matching stones was clasped around her throat, its weight pressing against her collarbone like a physical manifestation of her bondage. Earrings dangled from her lobes, catching the light whenever she moved her head. Each addition felt less like adornment and more like another link in an increasingly ornate chain. The gown they dressed her in was crimson silk embroidered with gold thread, the king's colors. Its bodice was cut lower than anything she had ever worn, the tight corseting beneath pushing her modest breasts upward in a way that made her flush with embarrassment. The skirt flared dramatically from her waist, layers of fabric rustling with each movement. Slippers of soft gold leather completed the transformation. When they finally allowed her to look in a polished silver mirror, Elowen barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Gone was the miller's daughter with honest eyes and a determined set to her jaw. In her place stood a doll dressed in royal finery, beautiful, perhaps, but hollow. "It will have to do," Lady Marwen pronounced. "Remember your station tonight. Speak little, smile graciously, and above all, do not embarrass His Majesty." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Elowen was escorted to the great hall. The space had been transformed since her pre-dawn glimpse of the king's private grief. Dozens of trestle tables arranged in a U-shape filled the room, each covered with fine linen cloths and set with silver plates and goblets. Hundreds of candles cast a golden glow over the scene, while musicians played softly from a gallery above. The smell of roasted meats, fresh bread, and exotic spices filled the air, reminding Elowen that she had barely eaten since her capture. The hall was already filled with courtiers in their finest attire, their jewels glittering like stars against the rich fabrics of their garments. As Elowen entered, a hush fell over the assembly, followed immediately by the rustle of whispers. She felt their eyes upon her, measuring, judging, condemning. The king sat at the head table upon a raised dais, his throne-like chair larger and more ornate than those around it. When he saw Elowen, something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps at the transformation Lady Marwen had wrought. He rose as she approached, offering a formal bow that sent another wave of murmurs through the court. "My queen," he said, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. "You honor us with your presence." The words were proper, the tone respectful, but Elowen could not help remembering the broken man she had glimpsed hours earlier. Was this the same person? The king gestured to the chair beside his own, and with as much dignity as she could muster, Elowen took her place at his side. The feast began with a flourish of trumpets. Servants streamed into the hall bearing platters of food more elaborate than anything Elowen had ever seen. Swans reconstructed in their feathers after roasting, pastry ships with sugar-spun sails, whole peacocks with their tail feathers splayed in magnificent fans. Wine flowed freely into golden goblets, its rich aroma mingling with the scents of roasted meats and exotic spices. But despite the abundance before her, Elowen found she had no appetite. The weight of the jewels around her neck and fingers seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. The corseted bodice restricted her breathing, turning each inhalation into a shallow gasp. And always, always, she felt the eyes of the court upon her, measuring, judging, condemning. It began subtly at first, a nobleman approaching the high table to offer congratulations, while his gaze raked over her with undisguised contempt. A lady who, while curtsying, whispered something to her companion that caused them both to titter behind jeweled fingers. The musicians played a country tune, one Elowen recognized from harvest festivals in her village, causing several courtiers to glance meaningfully in her direction. As the wine flowed more freely, the pretense of respect began to crumble. A young lord approached the high table, swaying slightly from drink, and performed an exaggerated bow. "Your Majesty," he slurred, addressing the king while his eyes fixed on Elowen. Might I inquire where one might find such rustic beauty? Perhaps I should search the pigsties for my own bride. Laughter rippled through those close enough to hear, growing louder when Eloin's cheeks flushed crimson with shame and anger. The king said nothing, his face an unreadable mask as he sipped his wine. Emboldened by this lack of rebuke, others joined in the sport. A noblewoman approached with an exaggerated curtsy. "My queen," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "might you share your secrets for maintaining such robust hands? Mine are so delicate they can scarcely hold a needle, let alone, I imagine, what was it you used in your former life? A millstone?" More laughter, more whispers, a piece of bread tossed carelessly onto the floor near her feet, as if offering scraps to a dog. Eloin sat rigidly in her chair, her knuckles white around the stem of her untouched goblet. Fury boiled inside her, threatening to spill over in scalding waves. How dare they? These pampered, privileged creatures who had never known a day's real work or hardship in their lives. How dare they mock her origins? She glanced at the king, expecting to find him amused by her humiliation. Instead, she saw his jaw clenched tight, the tendons in his neck standing out like cords. His knuckles had whitened around his goblet, mirroring her own grip. As she watched, his eyes swept the room with a coldness that sent a chill down her spine. The mockery continued, growing bolder with each passing minute. A courtier tossed a handful of straw onto the floor before her table, suggesting it might make her feel more at home. Another mimicked the movements of grinding grain, his gestures crude and suggestive. Blood pounded in Eloin's ears, drowning out the music and laughter. Her vision narrowed until all she could see was the sea of smirking faces before her. The room seemed to tilt and sway, the weight of the jewels threatening to drag her down into the floor. Then, without warning, the king slammed his goblet down on the table with such force that wine splashed across the pristine linen cloth like blood. The hall fell instantly silent, all eyes turning toward the high table. King Aldrich rose to his feet in one fluid motion, his height and bearing commanding immediate attention. His face had transformed, all traces of the grieving man Eloin had glimpsed that morning completely erased. In his place stood something far more dangerous, a predator among prey. "Enough," he said, the single word carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent hall. With deliberate movements, he extended his hand to Eloin. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her jewel-encrusted fingers in his palm. The king drew her to her feet beside him, then faced the assembled court. "She is my queen," he announced, his voice resonating with quiet menace. "She wears my crown, bears my name, and sits at my right hand. Whoever dishonors her challenges me." The silence that followed was absolute. Eloin could hear nothing but the crackling of the torches and the rapid beating of her own heart. The courtiers who had been so bold moments before now lowered their eyes, their faces pale with sudden fear. The king's hand remained wrapped around hers, warm and surprisingly strong. She could feel the calluses on his palm, unexpected evidence that the monarch was no stranger to swordplay and physical labor. It was a warrior's hand, not a pampered royal's. Confusion flooded through her. Why would he defend her now, when he had allowed the mockery to begin? What game was he playing? And why did his touch send such conflicting signals racing through her body? Both the desire to pull away and the unexpected urge to tighten her grip. Before she could untangle these thoughts, a voice broke the silence. Clear, deliberate, and dripping with disdain. "With respect, Your Majesty," the voice said, "the people will never accept a peasant queen. A primera traição." All heads turned toward the source of the bold declaration. Lord Devereux, the king's high chamberlain, stood with one hand resting casually on the hilt of his ceremonial dagger. His silver-streaked dark hair and impeccably trimmed beard framed features that might have been handsome were they not twisted with such obvious contempt. Unlike the other courtiers who now shrank back in fear, Devereux held his ground, his posture radiating the confidence of a man secure in his position and power. "The common folk," he continued, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silent hall, "look to the throne for stability and strength. They expect certain standards to be maintained." His gaze flicked dismissively over Eloin, lingering on her face as if examining a flawed piece of merchandise. "A queen plucked from the ashes of a rebellious village sends a dangerous message, Your Majesty, one that your enemies will not hesitate to exploit." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly, growing in volume as courtiers exchanged glances of renewed boldness. Elowen felt the king's hand tighten momentarily around hers before he released it. The sudden absence of his touch left her feeling strangely vulnerable, as if a shield had been withdrawn. "And who?" King Aldrich asked, his voice deceptively soft. "Are these enemies you speak of, Lord Devereux? Perhaps you number among them yourself." A collective intake of breath swept through the hall. Such an accusation, even veiled as it was, constituted a direct challenge to one of the most powerful nobles in the realm. Devereux's face darkened, but he maintained his composure with practiced ease. "I have served the crown loyally for 3 decades, Your Majesty, through your father's reign and now yours. My concern is only for the stability of the kingdom." "Your concern," the king replied, "is noted and dismissed." Tension crackled in the air between the two men like heat lightning before a storm. Elowen watched the silent battle of wills, acutely aware that she was merely the pretext for a power struggle whose roots ran far deeper than her sudden elevation to royalty. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Devereux offered a stiff bow. "As you wish, Your Majesty." His eyes, however, remained defiant as he straightened. "I pray your unconventional choice brings you the satisfaction you seek." With those parting words, laden with insinuation, the High Chamberlain turned and strode from the hall. In his wake, the atmosphere remained charged with unease. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, punctuated by furtive glances toward the high table. King Aldrich gestured to the musicians, who hastily resumed playing. Servants scurried to clear plates and refill goblets. The feast continued, but the earlier mockery had been replaced by a brittle veneer of politeness that threatened to shatter at the slightest touch. Elowen sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly weak. The humiliation she had endured was now compounded by the realization that she had become a pawn in a game of court politics she barely comprehended. The king had defended her honor, true, but had he done so out of genuine concern, or merely to assert his authority against a perceived challenge? She glanced at him from the corner of her eye. His profile was stern, jaw clenched as he stared out over the assembly with the wariness of a wolf surrounded by rivals. There was no trace now of the broken man she had glimpsed in the pre-dawn darkness, weeping alone before his throne. "Eat," he said quietly, not looking at her. They watched for every sign of weakness. Obediently, Elowen picked up her fork and speared a morsel of roasted pheasant. The rich food tasted like ashes in her mouth, but she forced herself to chew and swallow under the scrutiny of 100 calculating gazes. The weight of the jewels around her neck seemed to increase with each passing moment, the tight bodice of her gown restricting her breath until she felt lightheaded. The remainder of the banquet passed in a blur of forced pleasantries and veiled insults. Nobles approached the high table to offer congratulations that rang hollow, their eyes cold with assessment as they evaluated the peasant girl who now bore the title of queen. Elowen responded as Lady Marwen had instructed, speaking little, smiling graciously, betraying nothing of the tumult within. When at last the king rose to signal the end of the feast, Elowen felt almost faint with relief. He offered his arm with formal courtesy, and she placed her fingers lightly upon his sleeve as he escorted her from the hall. The touch of the fine velvet beneath her fingertips reminded her again of how far she had been thrust from everything familiar. They walked in silence through the torchlit corridors, accompanied by 4 stone-faced guards. Elowen expected to be returned to her chambers, but instead, the king led her to a small courtyard garden open to the night sky. The guards remained at the entrance, maintaining a discreet distance that offered the illusion of privacy. Moonlight silvered the leaves of carefully pruned shrubs and cast deep shadows beneath stone benches. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of night-blooming flowers, a welcome respite after the stifling atmosphere of the great hall. "You conducted yourself with dignity," the king said at last, his voice low enough that the guards could not overhear. "Despite provocation." Elouan wasn't certain if it was meant as a compliment or merely an observation. "They hate me," she replied simply. "They fear what they do not understand." He turned to face her, his expression inscrutable in the moonlight. "And they do not understand why I chose you." The question that had burned in her mind since her capture finally escaped her lips. "Why did you? Why destroy my village only to make me queen?" For a moment she thought he might actually answer. Something flickered in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or the shadow of the grief she had witnessed earlier. But then his expression hardened, the vulnerability vanishing as completely as if it had never existed. "It is late," he said. "My guards will escort you to your chambers." With a brief nod, he turned and strode from the garden, leaving Elouan alone with her unanswered questions and the weight of the court's hostility pressing down upon her. The journey back to her rooms seemed longer than before, the corridors darker and more threatening. By the time she reached the safety of her chamber door, Elouan's nerves were stretched to breaking point. She dismissed the waiting maids with a gesture, craving solitude after hours of scrutiny. Alone at last, she tore at the elaborate pins in her hair, wincing as they caught and pulled before coming free. The heavy necklace and rings followed, cast carelessly onto a table where they gleamed dully in the candlelight. The gown proved more challenging, its laces and hooks positioned deliberately beyond her reach, requiring assistance to remove. Frustrated, she sank onto a cushioned window seat, still half imprisoned in the finery that marked her new station. Through the leaded glass, she could see the moon sailing high above the castle walls, the same moon that had shone over her village on the night before its destruction. How many lifetimes ago that seemed now? A soft rustle drew her attention to the floor near the door. A folded piece of parchment had been slipped beneath it, the creamy surface blank save for a single crimson wax seal. With trembling fingers, Elouan retrieved it and broke the seal. The message inside was brief, written in a precise, educated hand. "You will be the key to his downfall." No signature, no clue as to the sender's identity. Yet the implication was clear enough. Someone within the castle walls saw her as a weapon to be wielded against the king. Elouan stared at the parchment, her thoughts racing. Sir Tristan had warned her that others would try to use her pain for their own purposes. Was this message from him? A test, perhaps, or from some other faction seeking to manipulate her hatred for their own ends. She crossed to the fireplace and held the parchment over the flames, watching as the edges blackened and curled before the fire consumed it entirely. The ashes drifted down to join the glowing embers below, leaving no trace of the treasonous words. As she turned away from the hearth, a new awareness settled over her like a cloak. She was standing at the center of a web of intrigue whose strands extended in all directions. The nobles who had mocked her at the banquet, Lord Devereux with his barely veiled challenge, the mysterious Sir Tristan with his warnings, and now this anonymous message. All sought to use her in some fashion. Even the king himself, with his contradictory behavior, destroying her village yet defending her honor, weeping alone yet maintaining his cold facade before others, played a game whose rules she did not yet comprehend. For the first time since her capture, Elouan felt a strange sense of power stirring within her. These people might see her as a pawn, but even a pawn could change the outcome of a game if moved with sufficient care. Perhaps her greatest advantage lay in their underestimation of her, the assumption that a miller's daughter would be too simple, too overwhelmed to understand the currents of power that swirled around her. She would watch, she would listen, and when the time was right, she would act, not as anyone's tool, but according to her own judgment. With newfound resolve, Elouan managed to loosen the laces of her gown enough to slip free of its confines. Dressed only in a simple shift, she moved to the window once more, gazing out at the moonlit castle grounds as she considered the day's events. One thing seemed increasingly clear. Nothing about her situation was as straightforward as it had first appeared. The king was not merely a tyrant, the court not merely a collection of pampered nobles, and she herself not merely a victim of circumstance. There were secrets buried here, secrets that might explain why her village had been targeted, why she had been chosen as queen, why the king wept alone in the darkness. And somewhere in those secrets, Elouan suspected, lay her path to either vengeance or redemption, though which she would ultimately seek, even she could not yet say. Entre deux fogos. 3 days passed before Eowyn saw Sir Tristan again. 3 days of navigating the treacherous currents of court life, where every smile concealed contempt and every courtesy masked calculation. She had learned to move through the castle with her head held high, ignoring the whispers that followed in her wake like poisonous shadows. The king had kept his distance, appearing only at formal occasions where protocol demanded their joint presence. Each night she lay awake wondering about the tears she had witnessed, the mystery that seemed to shroud her capture and elevation. On the afternoon of the 4th day, remembering Tristan's advice, Eowyn directed her ladies-in-waiting to remain behind while she took a solitary walk in the eastern gardens. Lady Marwyn had protested, a queen should never be unattended, but Eowyn had discovered that her new title, however despised, carried certain privileges. When she hardened her voice and repeated her command, even the formidable Lady Marwyn was forced to acquiesce. The eastern gardens were as Tristan had described, a forgotten corner of the castle grounds where formal beds had been allowed to grow somewhat wild. Ancient stone walls draped with ivy enclosed the space, creating the illusion of privacy. A crumbling fountain at the center had long since ceased to flow, its basin now home to moss and tiny wildflowers that had seeded themselves in the cracks. Eowyn wandered the overgrown paths, breathing deeply of air perfumed with herbs and flowers. For the first time since her capture, she felt something close to peace. Here, away from watching eyes, she could lower the mask of composure she had worn so carefully. "You found your way, then?" She whirled around, heart leaping to her throat. Sir Tristan stood in the shadow of an ancient oak, his tall figure half concealed by its gnarled trunk. Today he wore a simple tunic of dark blue, rather than the ornate court dress or armor she had expected. Without these trappings of rank, he appeared younger, less formidable, though no less watchful. "You startled me," she said, one hand pressed to her chest. "Forgive me, Your Majesty." He stepped forward, offering a formal bow that somehow conveyed genuine respect rather than the hollow mockery she had grown accustomed to. "This garden offers privacy, but we should still speak quietly." Eowyn glanced around the enclosed space. "Are there spies even here?" A grim smile touched his lips. "In this castle, the very stones have ears." He gestured toward a stone bench partially hidden by a climbing rose. Eowyn seated herself, arranging the folds of her gown. Simpler than the elaborate court dress she had worn to the banquet, but still finer than anything she had known in her former life. Tristan remained standing, his posture alert as he scanned the garden. "You have survived your first days as queen," he observed. "No small feat given the circumstances. I had little choice. There is always a choice, Your Majesty. Some have broken under less pressure than you have faced." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Perhaps I am not yet broken because I have not yet fully understood the danger of my position." Tristan's expression grew serious. "That is why I asked you to meet me. The events at the banquet have accelerated matters. Lord Devereux's public challenge was the first move in a game that has been building for months." "A game I was thrust into without my consent," Eowyn said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "Yes." He did not attempt to soften this truth. "And now you must decide which pieces you will play, and which will play you. Speak plainly, Sir Tristan. I have had my fill of riddles and half-truths." He studied her face for a long moment, as if measuring her readiness for what he was about to reveal. Then he lowered himself to one knee before her, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There is a faction within the court that believes the king has lost his way. That his recent actions, including the destruction of your village, are evidence of a monarch who can no longer be trusted with the realm's welfare. And you are part of this faction," Eowyn surmised. "I lead it," he corrected quietly. "We have been gathering evidence, building support among those nobles who remember a time when Aldrich ruled with wisdom rather than fear. The attack on your village was the final proof we needed that something is deeply wrong." Eowyn's mind raced. "You want to use me against him. As his queen, I would have access, information, perhaps even influence," Tristan finished. "Your position is unique, Your Majesty. The king's unexpected choice of a bride has created an opportunity we never anticipated. From within his tunic, he withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. Carefully unfolding the fabric, he revealed a dagger no longer than her hand. Its hilt was simple yet elegant, the blade gleaming with deadly promise in the dappled sunlight. "This can be concealed easily within the folds of a gown," he said, offering it to her, "or beneath a pillow." Eowyn stared at the weapon, understanding its implication instantly. "You ask me to become an assassin? I ask you to be prepared, to have a means of defense or," he hesitated, "or attack should circumstances demand it." Her hand trembled as she reached for the dagger. Its weight was surprising, heavier than it appeared, as if burdened by the gravity of its purpose. The metal was cold against her palm, a stark contrast to the warmth of the spring day. "You spoke of evidence?" she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Evidence of what, exactly? What drives the king to act as he does?" Tristan's eyes darted around the garden again before he replied. "There are rumors of dark practices, ancient texts discovered and consulted in secret. Some say the king has been communicating with forces beyond our understanding." "You believe he practices witchcraft?" Eowyn couldn't keep the skepticism from her tone. "I believe something changed him," Tristan replied carefully. "The Aldrich I swore to serve 5 years ago would never have ordered the destruction of an innocent village. He was firm but fair, beloved by his people. Then came the expedition to the eastern ruins, and upon his return..." He shook his head. It was as if a different man wore the king's face. Eowyn thought of the weeping figure she had glimpsed in the great hall, hardly the image of a tyrant corrupted by dark powers. Yet how else to explain the ruthless destruction of her home? "Why my village?" she asked, the question that had haunted her since the attack. "What could we possibly have that would matter to a king?" "That," said Tristan, "is what we have been unable to discover. But it must be significant to have warranted such attention." He rose to his feet in one fluid motion. "The king keeps a private study in the North Tower. No one enters save himself. Not even servants are permitted to clean it. Whatever secrets he harbors, they likely reside there." Eowyn's fingers closed around the dagger. "And you expect me, as his queen, to gain entry to this forbidden place? In time, perhaps. For now, watch and listen. Learn his patterns, his weaknesses." Tristan's expression softened slightly. "I know what I ask is difficult. You have every reason to hate the king, to desire vengeance for your village, your family." "Yes," Eowyn agreed, thinking of her father's body pierced by arrows, her mother's despairing cry. "I do." Yet even as she spoke, unwelcome doubt crept into her mind. The memory of the king defending her at the banquet, the sound of his broken sobs in the empty hall, the flickers of humanity she had glimpsed beneath his cold exterior. These complicated the pure hatred she had nursed since her capture. Tristan must have sensed her conflicted thoughts, for he leaned closer, his voice urgent. "Do not be deceived by any show of kindness, Your Majesty. Remember what he did to your people. Remember why you are here." He was right, of course. Whatever inner turmoil the king might suffer, whatever regret he might feel in private moments, none of it erased the destruction he had wrought. The dagger felt suddenly heavier in her hand, its purpose more immediate and terrible. "I should return," she said, rising from the bench. "My absence will be noted if I linger too long." Tristan bowed again. "We will speak again when it is safe. Until then, keep the dagger close, and your true thoughts closer still." As he melted back into the shadows of the garden, Eowyn carefully concealed the weapon within the folds of her gown. Its presence against her thigh was a constant reminder of the choice that now lay before her: to become an instrument of Tristan's conspiracy, or to find her own path through the labyrinth of court intrigue. She retraced her steps toward the castle, her mind churning with conflicting thoughts. The king had destroyed her village, killed her father, torn her from everything she had ever known. By all rights, she should welcome any opportunity for vengeance. Yet something held her back. Some instinct that warned the truth was more complex than either her hatred or Tristan's conspiracy allowed for. That night, alone in her chambers, Eowyn removed the dagger from its hiding place and held it to the candlelight. The blade caught the flame and reflected it back, transformed into a thin line of fire. Such a small thing to hold such power, the power to end a life, to change the course of a kingdom. If she chose the path Tristan offered, she would betray the king. If she rejected it, she would lose perhaps her only chance at vengeance for her village. Both choices carried impossible weight. Tears of frustration and confusion stung her eyes as she clutched the dagger. In the space of mere days, she had been transformed from a simple miller's daughter to a queen with the fate of a kingdom potentially in her hands. How could she possibly know which choice was right when every path seemed tangled with deception? The soft sound of the door latch lifting froze her in place. Hastily, she rose to her feet, the dagger still clutched in her hand as she faced the entrance to her chamber. The door swung open, revealing the last person she expected to see at this hour. King Aldrich himself, without guards or attendants, his expression unreadable as his eyes fell upon the blade in her trembling hand. O destino sorprendente. Time seemed to crystallize around them. Ellawen stood motionless, the dagger gleaming in her hand, her breath trapped in her lungs. King Aldrich remained in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor behind him. Neither spoke. The only sound in the chamber was the soft crackling of the fire and the distant call of a night bird beyond the window. Ellawen's mind raced with desperate calculations. Could she hide the weapon? Impossible. He had already seen it. Could she use it? The thought sent a wave of nausea through her. Despite everything, she had never taken a life, had never imagined herself capable of such an act. And even if she could overcome that instinctive revulsion, the king was a trained warrior, larger and stronger than her. Any attempt would surely fail, yet he made no move to summon guards, to accuse her, to defend himself. He simply closed the door behind him with a soft click and advanced into the room, his movements deliberately slow, as if approaching a frightened animal. "Your Majesty," Ellawen finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not expect you." A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "Clearly not." His eyes never left the dagger. "I see you have found means to arm yourself in my castle." Ellawen's fingers tightened around the hilt, though whether in preparation to strike or simply from fear, she could not have said. "Should I not protect myself? From me?" He took another step forward, close enough now that she could see the shadows beneath his eyes, the lines of fatigue etched into his face. He looked older tonight, worn down by burdens she could only guess at. "Is that why you hold a blade in your chamber? To protect yourself from your husband?" The word husband struck her like a physical blow. In all the chaos and confusion of the past days, she had managed to avoid thinking of him in those terms. He was her captor, her enemy, the destroyer of her village. But husband? That implied an intimacy, a connection that she refused to acknowledge. "You are not my husband in any true sense," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "A ceremony performed under duress creates no real bond." "No," he agreed, surprising her further. "It does not." He moved past her to stand before the fire, extending his hands toward the flames as if seeking warmth despite the mild spring night. The dancing light caught the signet ring he wore, casting fractured reflections across the stone walls. "Sir Tristan gave you the dagger, I assume," he said without turning. Shock coursed through her. "How did you—" "I know more about what happens in my castle than my enemies believe." Still, he did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Tristan has been plotting against me for months. I've allowed it, curious to see how far he would go, who he would recruit to his cause." "And now?" Ellawen asked, the dagger suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in her hand. "Will you have him executed for treason?" "That would depend," the king said, finally turning to face her, "on what you intend to do with that blade." The question hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken meanings. Ellawen looked down at the dagger, then back at the king. The firelight caught the planes of his face, revealing a complexity of emotion she had not expected. Weariness, yes, but also something that looked remarkably like resignation. "I don't know," she admitted, the truth escaping before she could consider its wisdom. "An honest answer." He nodded slightly, as if appreciating the candor. "Then allow me to make a proposal. If you wish to kill me, Do so tomorrow, in the light of day, before the entire court. Ilawan stared at him, certain she had misheard. What? If you believe my death will bring justice for your village, for your family, then take that blade to the great hall tomorrow and strike me down before witnesses. He stepped closer, his voice lowering. But tonight, be simply yourself. No plots, no vengeance, no crowns or titles between us. Just two people seeking understanding in a world gone mad. The dagger trembled in her hand. How can you ask that? How can you speak of understanding when you destroyed everything I loved? Because I have lost everything I loved as well. The words emerged raw and unguarded, as if torn from somewhere deep within him. Because I wake each night drowning in the weight of choices I was forced to make. Because I look at you and see not just the village I destroyed, but the man I once was. He extended his hand, palm upward. After a moment of paralyzing indecision, Eloin placed the dagger in it. The king's fingers closed around the hilt, then, in a gesture that stole her breath, he reversed the blade and offered it back to her, handle first. Keep it, he said softly. I would not deny you the means to defend yourself, even against me, especially against me. Ilawan accepted the weapon, unable to comprehend this strange surrender. She placed it on a nearby table, suddenly unwilling to hold it while they spoke. Why did you come here tonight? Because I saw you in the eastern garden with Tristan. He moved to the window, gazing out at the star-filled sky. Because I knew he would fill your head with tales of my madness, my cruelty. Because I needed, to see your face when you made your choice. What choice? Whether to believe him without question, or to seek the truth for yourself. Eloin shook her head, frustration welling within her. You speak of truth while offering only riddles. If you wish me to understand, then explain. Why was my village destroyed? Why make me queen? What game are you playing? The king was silent for so long she thought he would refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of confession. 6 months ago, I discovered an ancient text in the royal archives. It spoke of a prophecy concerning a village in the eastern valleys, your village, and a power that lay dormant beneath it. A power that, if awakened, could either save the kingdom or destroy it utterly. Eloin frowned. My village was built on rocky soil and stubborn sheep. There was no power there. Not above ground, the king agreed, but beneath. The text spoke of catacombs dating back 1,000 years, sealed away for a reason. It claimed that if the seals were broken, a darkness would be released that could not be contained. And you believed this? You destroyed an entire village based on a moldering scroll? I disbelieved it, he corrected, until my scouts reported that mercenaries in the employ of my enemies were excavating beneath your village in secret. They had found an entrance to the catacombs and were working to break the ancient seals. Ilawan's mind raced. She remembered strange men who had appeared in the village last winter, claiming to be traders but asking unusual questions about the old ruins in the hills. At the time, no one had thought much of it. So you burned my home to stop them, she said, the pieces beginning to fall into place. But why not simply send soldiers to arrest these mercenaries? Why such wholesale destruction? Pain flickered across the king's features. Because by the time I learned the truth, they had already broken the first seal. The text was clear. Once begun, the process could not be halted except by purifying fire. Anything less risked releasing whatever lay entombed below. Eloin thought of her father, her neighbors, the children who had played in the village square, all sacrificed for some ancient superstition. And making me queen? What part does that play in your prophecy? The text spoke of one who would survive the fire, whose blood carried protection against the darkness. His eyes met hers, their depths haunted. When I saw you standing in the ruins, something called to me. I knew you were the one the prophecy described. Ilawan wanted to dismiss his words as madness, yet she could not deny the ring of truth in his voice. And there had been strange tales in her village, stories passed down through generations of a time when darkness had risen from the earth and been driven back by ancestors whose names were now lost to history. Even if I believed you, she said slowly, it doesn't justify such suffering. No, he agreed, his voice barely audible. Nothing could. Each night I hear their cries in my dreams. Each day I wear the crown knowing the price paid for the kingdom's safety. It is a burden I would not wish upon my worst enemy. The stark honesty of his admission struck Alawan with unexpected force. This was not the calculated manipulation she had feared, nor the raving of a madman as Tristan had suggested. This was the confession of a man torn apart by the weight of impossible choices. "What happens now?" she asked, uncertain of her own feelings in the face of these revelations. Now, the king, Aldrich, looked at her with an expression that contained both hope and resignation. "Now you decide. Tomorrow you can take that dagger to the Great Hall and end my reign before all the court, as I offered. Few would blame you, many would cheer." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his gray eyes, could smell the faint scent of pine and leather that clung to him. "Or you could choose a different path. Not forgiveness, I ask for none and deserve less, but perhaps understanding, perhaps even alliance against enemies who would use the darkness for their own ends." Eloin studied his face, searching for deception and finding only exhaustion and a fragile, desperate honesty. In that moment, she saw not the monster who had haunted her nightmares, but a man as broken as she was, perhaps more so, for he carried not only his own pain but the weight of an entire kingdom's fate. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she said softly, "but I would hear more of this darkness, this prophecy. I would know the full truth before I choose any path." Something like relief flickered across his features. "Then let us speak plainly, you and I. No more secrets, no more half-truths. Ask what you will and I shall answer as best I can." And so, as the night deepened around them, two enemies became something else entirely. Not friends, certainly not lovers, but perhaps reluctant allies in understanding a truth larger than their individual pain. The dagger lay forgotten on the table as they talked, their voices low and intent, weaving together a tapestry of ancient prophecies and present dangers, of personal losses and shared concerns. When dawn finally lightened the sky, they had reached no easy resolution, no dramatic reconciliation. But something had shifted between them. A recognition that the world was not divided neatly into heroes and villains, victims and oppressors, but rather populated by flawed souls trying to navigate impossible choices with insufficient knowledge. And when, weeks later, they stood together before the assembled court to address the growing threat from beyond their borders, the people did not see a tyrant and his captive bride, but two leaders united by a common purpose, their shared humanity more powerful than the wounds that had initially divided them. For in the ruins of hatred, compassion had found unlikely soil in which to take root. And though the path ahead remained fraught with danger, they faced it not as king and unwilling queen, but as two broken people who had glimpsed in each other the possibility of becoming whole again. Sometimes the most profound wisdom emerges from our darkest moments of suffering. Ilawan faced an impossible choice: cling to justified hatred or find the courage to see beyond it to a truth more complex than vengeance would allow. What would you have done in her place? Would you have plunged the dagger into the heart of the man who destroyed everything you loved? Or would you have recognized the broken soul behind the crown? In a world that constantly demands we choose sides, victim or oppressor, hero or villain, perhaps the most revolutionary act is to recognize the humanity in those we've been taught to hate. Not to excuse their actions, but to understand that even our enemies carry wounds we cannot see, fighting battles we cannot comprehend. True strength isn't found in never falling, but in how we rise from the ashes of our deepest pain. If this story touched your heart, remember that your support helps bring more tales like this to life. Take a moment to follow this channel for more emotional journeys that challenge what we think we know about love, forgiveness, and the complicated nature of being human. Share this story with someone who might need to remember that even in our darkest hours, destiny can surprise us in ways we never imagined.